The year is 1985. To understand 1985, you first have to understand the silence that came before it. Just 2 years prior, the North American video game industry had driven itself off a cliff. The crash of '83 had decimated revenues, turning a $3.2 billion industry into a graveyard of unwanted cartridges buried in the New Mexico desert. By the time 1985 rolled around, the common wisdom among retailers in America was simple. Video games are a fad, and the fad is over. The market collapsed to the absolute minimum, 100 million, a 97% drop in just 2 years. But while the consoles gathered dust, a different heart was beating. In the living rooms of 1985, the computer was king. If you were a gamer this year, you likely weren't holding a joystick plugged into a console. You were typing commands into a keyboard. The Commodore 64 was at its absolute peak, dominating the low-end market. It wasn't just a machine, it was a phenomenon, selling roughly 2 million units a year. In Europe, specifically the UK, the battle lines were drawn between the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. This was the year of the bedroom coder, an era where teenagers in their bedrooms were writing the games that defined a generation. And 1985 wasn't just about the old guard. It was the dawn of the 16-bit revolution. This year saw the release of the Atari 520 ST and the legendary Amiga 1000. These weren't just game machines, they were powerhouses, offering graphics and sound that for the first time threatened to rival the arcade. Speaking of arcade, don't let anyone tell you it was dead. In 1985, the arcade was vibrant, difficult, and loud. This was the year Atari games gave us Gauntlet, a dungeon crawler that devoured quarters and friendships with the iconic phrase, "Warrior needs food badly." Capcom unleashed Ghosts and Goblins, a game so punishingly difficult it became legendary. Sega pushed technology forward with Space Harrier and Hang On, games that used superscalar technology to create a sense of 3D speed that felt impossible at the time. And Konami defined the scrolling shooter with Gradius. The arcade wasn't dying, it was evolving. But the most important story of 1985 was happening in Japan, and it was about to land in New York City. In Japan, the Famicom, Nintendo's family computer, was already a massive success, but Nintendo wanted America. The problem? American retailers hated video games. They wouldn't touch them. So Nintendo had to lie. They redesigned their machine to look like a VCR. They called it the Nintendo Entertainment System. They didn't call it a console, they called it a control deck. And crucially, they packed it with a plastic robot named R.O.B, insisting to toy stores that this wasn't a video game, it was an interactive toy. On October 18, 1985, Nintendo launched a limited test market in New York City. They famously offered a money-back guarantee to stores for any unsold inventory. It was a gamble that could have bankrupted their American division. Leading the charge was a game released in Japan just a month prior, on September 13th, a game called Super Mario Bros. It didn't just sell the system, it saved the industry. While Nintendo was trying to sneak into toy stores, a different revolution was taking the stage in New York City. Unlike the silent Trojan horse approach of the NES, this one arrived with a tuxedo, a live orchestra, and a pop star. On July 23, 1985, at the Lincoln Center, Commodore unveiled the Amiga 1000. To understand why this machine was such a shock to the system, you have to look at what else was on the desk in 1985. The IBM PC was a monochrome workhorse, beeping and grinding through spreadsheets, while the Macintosh was friendly but strictly black and white. Then came the Amiga, and suddenly the world was in color.
To truly appreciate the Amiga 1000, we have to look past the beige plastic and look at the main board, because the architecture was radically different from anything else on the market in 1985. The system was built around the Motorola 68000 CPU, running at approximately 7 MHz. While this was the same processor found in the Macintosh, the Amiga didn't force the CPU to do all the work. Instead, the engineers at Commodore designed a unified memory architecture where the CPU shared the bus with the original chipset, or OCS. This trio of custom chips, Agnes, Denise, and Paula, acted as specialized coprocessors, effectively freeing up the main CPU to handle game logic, while the chips handled the audio visuals. The most critical of these chips was likely Agnes, the central coordinator of the system's memory. Agnes contained two revolutionary components, the blitter and the copper. The blitter was a hardware circuit dedicated solely to moving large blocks of memory very quickly, perfect for scrolling game backgrounds or dragging windows without bothering the CPU. The copper was arguably even more exotic. It was a display coprocessor that could execute its own simple instruction list synchronized to the electron beam of the monitor. This allowed the Amiga to change screen resolutions, color palettes, and sprites mid-frame without using a single cycle of the main processor, creating the machine's signature rainbow gradients and parallax scrolling effects. Working alongside Agnes was Denise, the video chip that defined the visual experience. Denise handled the bitplane graphics, supporting resolutions ranging from 320 by 200 up to 640 by 400 in interlaced mode. However, its most distinct technical feature was Hold and Modify, or ham mode. By compressing color data, ham allowed the system to display all 4,096 distinct colors on screen simultaneously. In 1985, when PC CGA cards were limited to 4 hideous distinct colors, the Amiga was displaying almost photorealistic images. To complete the trio, the Paula chip handled I/O and interrupts, but is best known for its audio, 4 distinct hardware channels of 8-bit PCM sampled sound split into hard left and right stereo, allowing for music that sounded like actual instruments rather than synthesized beeps. A unique quirk of the Amiga 1000's engineering was its writable control store. Unlike the Macintosh or the later Amiga 500, the 1000 did not ship with its operating system burned onto a ROM chip on the motherboard. Because the software team was still squashing bugs right up until launch, the machine required a kickstart floppy disk to be inserted upon boot. This loaded the 256 kilobyte Core OS kernel into a special section of RAM that was then write-protected by the hardware to act as a temporary ROM. While this added a step to the boot process, it made the Amiga 1000 incredibly flexible, as it could easily run updated versions of the OS kernel by just swapping a floppy disk. Finally, the software architecture was held together by exec, a microkernel that enabled the system's legendary multitasking. Exec managed the system's memory list and handled task switching with incredible efficiency. It utilized a message passing system where different programs and hardware devices could communicate without locking the system. This worked in tandem with Intuition, the GUI system, which leveraged the shared chip RAM. Because the video chip could read the exact same memory location the CPU was writing to, Windows and graphics appeared instantly, without the data bottlenecks found in other systems. This synergy of hardware-accelerated custom chips and a microkernel OS made the Amiga 1000, technically speaking, the first true multimedia workstation.
Also released in 1985 by Commodore was the Commodore 128, the last great gasp of the 8-bit era. Marketed as 3 computers in one, it featured dual processors and 80-column text support for business users. Crucially, it offered near-perfect backward compatibility with the Commodore 64, ensuring gamers didn't lose their existing library. While it was a commercial success, the C-128 was ultimately a bridge machine, a reliable workhorse that kept the company afloat while the world prepared for the 16-bit revolution. While Commodore was courting artists with the Amiga, their former boss was busy planning their destruction. Jack Tramiel, the man who had founded Commodore and was now running Atari Corporation, had a simple mission: revenge. His weapon was the Atari 520 ST, released in the summer of 1985 under the philosophy of power without the price. From an engineering standpoint, the ST was the philosophical opposite of the Amiga. It was a triumph of off-the-shelf brute force. While the Amiga relied on a symphony of custom silicon, Tramiel's team built the ST using standard, readily available components to keep costs down, prioritizing raw clock speed above all else. At the heart of the system was the Motorola 68000 CPU, clocked at a blistering 8 MHz, slightly faster than both the Amiga and the Macintosh. Because the ST lacked the complex custom coprocessors of its rival, the CPU had to handle almost everything, from game logic to drawing the screen, utilizing a direct, fast connection to the system's 512 kilobytes of RAM. Graphics were handled by a proprietary chip known as the shifter. Unlike the Amiga, it didn't use hardware sprites or blitter chips to move data. Instead, it used a pure bit-mapped frame buffer to output 3 distinct resolutions. While the color modes were competent, the engineering marvel was the high-resolution monochrome mode. When paired with the proprietary SM124 monitor, the ST pushed a resolution of 640 by 400 at a rock-solid 70 Hz. This created a display that was paper white and completely stable, earning the machine the nickname the Jackintosh for its ability to handle serious business tasks at a fraction of Apple's price. The user experience was tied together by GEM, a windowed, mouse-driven interface that loaded from floppy disks on early models. It was sharp, fast, and remarkably affordable. You could buy an entire 520 ST system, computer, monitor, and drive for $799, roughly half the cost of an Amiga setup. But the 520 ST had a secret weapon that would keep it relevant for decades: MIDI. While the system's internal audio was handled by a standard Yamaha YM2149 chip, capable only of basic square wave synthesis, the engineers made a critical hardware decision regarding connectivity. They integrated 2 Motorola 6850 ACIA chips specifically to drive MIDI in and out ports. By connecting these chips directly to the system's interrupt controller, the ST could process musical data with near-zero latency. This didn't just make the ST a computer, it made it a hardwired musical instrument, becoming the heartbeat of recording studios for artists ranging from bedroom producers to Madonna. In the brutal math of 1985, the Atari 520 ST offered the best price-to-performance ratio on the planet. It was a machine that proved you didn't need exotic architecture to deliver a revolution. You just needed a fast bus, a high-res screen, and the raw speed to drive it all. While the computer wars were raging over technical specifications, the most significant event of 1985 was taking place in a handful of skeptical toy stores in the New York City area. To understand why the Nintendo Entertainment System conquered the world, you have to look inside the gray box, because it was a masterclass in efficient, cost-effective engineering. At its heart sat the Rico 2A03 processor. This was a custom-modified version of the legendary MOS 6502, the same chip family found in the Apple II and Commodore 64. However, Nintendo's engineers made a fascinating tweak. They disabled the chip's decimal mode to avoid patent royalties and integrated a custom audio processing unit, APU, directly onto the same die. This allowed the NES to generate its signature sound:
2 pulse wave channels for melody, a triangle wave for bass, a noise channel for percussion, and a unique delta modulation channel capable of playing low-fidelity voice samples. The real visual magic, however, came from the Picture Processing Unit, or PPU. Running at 5.37 MHz, this custom chip was a dedicated tile-based graphics engine. Unlike the bit-mapped screens of the Atari ST or Amiga, where every pixel could be individually altered, the NES PPU built the screen out of 8 by 8 pixel tiles. It could display a palette of roughly 54 colors, but with a strict limitation. It could only show 25 colors on screen at once, and worse, each 16 by 16 pixel area on the background was limited to just 3 colors plus a transparency. This hardware limitation is exactly why Mario wears overalls. The developers needed a design that looked distinct while adhering to the system's strict color rules. The PPU also featured hardware scrolling, a massive advantage over computers like the ZX Spectrum or early PCs. It stored the screen data in a name table, allowing the entire background to slide smoothly horizontally or vertically with minimal CPU overhead. However, the system had a famous hard limit. It could only render 64 sprites on screen, and crucially, only 8 sprites per horizontal scan line. If a game tried to put a 9th sprite on the same row, the hardware simply refused to draw it, causing the infamous flicker seen in frantic action games when too many enemies crowded the screen. Perhaps the most notorious piece of engineering was the zero insertion force cartridge slot. To mimic the feel of a VCR, engineers designed a mechanism where the user slid the game in and pressed it down. This required a complex 72-pin connector, 12 more pins than the Japanese Famicom, to handle the signals and the new expansion port on the bottom of the unit. While it felt satisfyingly tactile in 1985, the bending of the pins over time led to connection failures, birthing the universal cultural ritual of blowing into the cartridge to clear the dust and reset the connection. Finally, the NES was designed as a fortress. It included the 10S chip, a proprietary lockout device that acted like a digital bouncer. The chip inside the console would constantly handshake with a matching chip inside the game cartridge. If the cartridge chip didn't respond correctly, or if it was a bootleg, the console would reset itself every second, resulting in a blinking red power light. This wasn't just about preventing piracy. It allowed Nintendo to maintain a stranglehold on the market, ensuring that no unauthorized software could ever run on their hardware, a level of control the open computer market had never seen.
While Nintendo was cautiously testing the waters in New York, their arch-rival in Tokyo was preparing a frontal assault based on raw power. On October 20, 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III in Japan, the console that would eventually be redesigned and rebranded for the rest of the world as the Master System. Sega was an arcade company first and a home console company second, and their design philosophy reflected this heritage. They didn't want to hide the fact that this was a video game machine. They wanted to prove it was the closest thing to having an arcade cabinet in your living room. From a technical perspective, the Mark III was a brute designed to outclass the Famicom in almost every measurable metric. It abandoned the custom architecture of Nintendo for the industrial-strength Zilog Z80A processor, clocked at 3.58 MHz. This was the same chip that powered the Game Boy and the Pac-Man arcade cabinet, making it a familiar beast for developers. Unlike the NES, which had to perform complex tricks to scroll the screen, the Sega hardware handled it with ease, and it maintained full backward compatibility with Sega's earlier SG-1000 console, ensuring early adopters weren't left behind. The system's crown jewel was its video display processor, a custom evolution of the Texas Instruments standard.
While the NES often struggled with drab, washed-out colors due to its limited palette, the Mark III boasted a vibrant, defined palette of 64 colors, with the ability to display 32 of them on screen simultaneously. This allowed for the signature Sega blue skies and bright, cartoon-like graphics that looked significantly sharper than Nintendo's output. To distribute this software, the console featured a unique dual-media architecture, a standard cartridge slot for large games, and a credit card-sized Sega Card slot for cheaper, smaller games, a futuristic format that Sega hoped would replace bulky cartridges. Audio was another battlefield where Sega aimed for dominance. Out of the box, the system used the SN76489 programmable sound generator, which offered 3 square waves and a noise channel, fairly standard for the time. However, the Japanese Mark III supported an optional FM sound unit, which utilized the YM2413 chip. This allowed games to feature rich, synthesized instrumentation that mimicked the high-end audio of arcade machines, a feature that was tragically cut from the Western Master System release the following year. Despite this technical superiority, the Mark III faced an insurmountable non-technical hurdle in 1985, Nintendo's licensing contracts. By the time Sega launched, Nintendo had already locked up the best third-party developers with exclusivity clauses, preventing them from porting their hits to Sega hardware. So, while the Mark III was arguably the better-engineered machine, capable of running advanced peripherals like 3D shutter glasses years before they were mainstream, it was forced to rely almost entirely on Sega's own internal arcade ports. In 1985, Sega proved they could build a better box, but they learned the hard way that the best hardware doesn't always win the war.
To understand why Windows 1.0 was such a strange beast in 1985, you have to look at what was running underneath it. It was not a standalone operating system. It was a glorified DOS program. When you typed Win at the command prompt, the system didn't reboot into a new mode. It simply loaded a graphical shell called the MS-DOS Executive. This file manager was the face of Windows 1.0. It was a stark, text-heavy list of files that looked suspiciously like the command line it was supposed to replace. But the engineering challenge lay in how it managed memory. MS-DOS was designed to run one thing at a time. To get multiple programs running simultaneously, Microsoft implemented cooperative multitasking. Unlike the Amiga's preemptive system, where the hardware forced programs to share, Windows 1.0 relied on the honor system. Each application had to voluntarily yield control back to the OS. If a poorly written calculator app froze, it didn't just crash itself, it locked the entire computer, forcing a hard reset. Visually, the system was defined by its limitations. The decision to use tiled windows, where windows could not overlap but snapped into a grid, wasn't just a design choice, it was a defensive maneuver. While engineers argued that tiling was more efficient for the limited resolution of 1985 monitors, the prevailing rumor was that Microsoft was terrified of infringing on Apple's overlapping Windows copyright. This constraint made the interface feel rigid and claustrophobic compared to the fluid desktop of the Macintosh. However, the true genius of Windows 1.0 wasn't the interface, it was the GDI, Graphics Device Interface. In 1985, if you were a developer making a DOS program, you had to write specific drivers for every single printer and graphics card on the market. It was a nightmare. Windows 1.0 introduced the concept of device independence. The GDI sat between the program and the hardware. A developer could write their word processor to talk to the GDI, and the GDI would handle the messy business of talking to the Epson dot matrix printer or the HP plotter. This was the Trojan horse that eventually won over developers. Writing for Windows was hard, but it meant you never had to write a printer driver again. The software bundle included with the system was designed to show off this potential. It came with Windows Write, a word processor, Windows Paint, licensed from Zsoft, a calendar, a card file, and a clock.
These weren't just utilities, they were proof-of-concept demos. They showed that you could cut text from one window and paste it into another, a seemingly magical feat for a PC user used to the isolation of MS-DOS. Technically, Windows 1.0 was a mess. It was slow, unstable, and ugly. But in the GDI, it held the blueprint for the future. It solved the biggest headache for software developers. And in the computer industry, if you win the developers, you eventually win the world.
In the United Kingdom, the gaming revolution wasn't happening in corporate boardrooms. It was happening in the bedrooms of solitary geniuses. The standout example from 1985 is Starquake, written by Stephen Crow for Bubblebus Software. It remains one of the finest examples of British microcomputer engineering, a game that managed to squeeze an entire universe onto a cassette tape for the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. The premise was panic-inducing. An unstable planet is about to explode, and you control a spherical droid, often referred to as a blob or biologically operated being. Your mission is to navigate the subterranean caverns to rebuild the planet's core before time runs out. Unlike the linear scrolling of Super Mario Bros., Starquake was a sprawling, non-linear maze. It boasted 512 distinct screens, a map size that was staggering for computers with only 48 to 64 kilobytes of memory. To achieve this, Crow used a clever compression technique where screens were built from a library of reusable tiles, allowing for a massive world without running out of RAM. Mechanically, it was distinct from the run-and-gun shooters of the arcade. It was a fast-paced puzzle platformer that emphasized utility over combat. The blob had the ability to hover and, crucially, to lay down its own temporary platforms or bridges. This mechanic turned the environment into a tool. If you couldn't reach a ledge, you simply built your own staircase. You also had to manage an inventory, carrying specific items like keycards and processor chips to their matching terminals across the map. Starquake was a critical darling, receiving near-perfect scores from influential magazines like Crash and Zap64, proving that in 1985, a single programmer could still out-design a corporation. In 1985, the arcade shooter was almost exclusively the domain of spaceships fighting aliens. Capcom changed the battlefield with Commando. Directed by the legendary Tokuro Fujiwara, the same man who designed Ghosts and Goblins, Commando stripped away the sci-fi fantasy and replaced it with gritty, Rambo-esque guerrilla warfare. The game introduced players to Super Joe, a lone soldier dropped into a jungle infested with an infinite army. The genius of Commando wasn't just in the shooting, it was in the pacing. It defined the vertical run-and-gun genre. The screen scrolled relentlessly upward, forcing players to constantly push forward into a hail of bullets. Mechanically, it was deceptively simple, but tactically deep. You had a machine gun with unlimited ammo for direct threats, but the game changer was the grenade. For the first time, players had to think about trajectory and cover. You weren't just shooting enemies, you were lobbing explosives over sandbags and into bunkers to clear out entrenched foes. While the arcade version was a massive hit, Commando became a cultural phenomenon in Europe thanks to its home computer ports released late in the year. The Commodore 64 version in particular is legendary, not just for the gameplay, but for its soundtrack. Composed by Rob Hubbard in a single night, the C64 music is widely considered one of the greatest pieces of chiptune music ever written. A pulsing electronic anthem that drove players to keep fighting no matter how many times Super Joe bit the dust. In 1985, Commando proved that you didn't need a spaceship to make an intense shooter. You just needed a bandana, a machine gun, and a lot of grenades. While American gamers were just getting comfortable with Ultima, Japan was already rewriting the rules of the role-playing game with Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu.
Released in October 1985 by Nihon Falcom, this game wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon, selling a staggering 400,000 copies. In the smaller, fragmented Japanese PC market, those were blockbuster numbers that remained a domestic sales record for decades. Xanadu was the bridge between the slow, thoughtful RPGs of the past and the adrenaline-fueled future. It was arguably the first true action RPG to reach a mass audience. The game abandoned turn-based battles for real-time combat. When you encountered a monster in the side-scrolling dungeon, the game switched to a top-down arena where you had to physically ram into enemies or blast them with magic to survive. It demanded reflexes, but it didn't sacrifice depth. The game featured a complex stat system where your character's appearance actually changed based on the equipment you wore, a visual detail that blew minds in 1985. But its most fascinating feature was the karma system. Xanadu judged you. If you killed good monsters by mistake, your karma stat would rise. If your karma got too high, temples would refuse to let you level up, and the game became unwinnable. It forced players to pay attention to what they were killing, rather than just mindlessly hacking everything in sight. Combining these systems with a massive, interconnected underground world that required specific items to unlock new areas, Xanadu laid the structural blueprint for what we now call the Metroidvania genre. It was a game years ahead of its time, proving that an RPG could be fast, difficult, and visually dynamic all at once.
In July 1985, Sega didn't just release a video game, they released a vehicle. At a time when arcade gaming meant standing still and wiggling a joystick, Hang-On demanded that you climb aboard. Designed by the legendary Yu Suzuki, Hang-On was the birth of the Taikon, or body sensation genre. The deluxe cabinet was a full-scale plastic replica of a GP500 motorcycle. To play it, you didn't turn a knob, you physically grabbed the handlebars and threw your body weight to the left or right to steer. It was a workout, a spectacle, and a level of immersion that home consoles wouldn't match for decades. But the plastic bike was just the wrapper. The real revolution was on the screen. Hang-On was the debut of Sega's proprietary superscaler technology. Before this, racing games usually felt flat, with cars scrolling passively across a background. Hang-On used powerful custom hardware to scale thousands of sprites in real time at a blistering 60 frames per second. As you accelerated, trees, rocks, and rival bikers didn't just slide past, they exploded from the horizon, growing from tiny dots to massive obstacles in an instant. This created a convincing illusion of three-dimensional depth and terrifying speed that polygon graphics wouldn't catch up to for years. In 1985, Hang-On was a statement of intent from Sega. It proved that the arcade experience was no longer just about high scores, it was about adrenaline. It transformed the arcade from a room full of screens into a high-tech amusement park.
While arcades were eating quarters and the Amiga was wowing artists, the most played game of 1985 wasn't found in a living room or a bar. It was found in the school library. In 1985, the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium released the definitive commercial version of the Oregon Trail for the Apple II. While text-based versions of the game had existed on mainframes since the 1970s, the 1985 release was the one that introduced graphics, the hunting minigame, and the iconic green screen visuals that defined a generation of students. For millions of children, this was their first introduction to the concept of resource management. The game disguised itself as a history lesson, but it was actually a brutal survival simulator. Players had to manage a budget to buy oxen, bullets, and spare parts, and then make agonizing decisions about the pace of travel and food rations. It taught children that poor planning had consequences, and those consequences were usually fatal. The 1985 version is best remembered for its action-oriented hunting minigame, where the slow, strategic pace was broken up by a frantic shooter segment. Players would slaughter thousands of pounds of buffalo, only to be taught a harsh lesson in wastefulness when the game informed them they could only carry 100 pounds of meat back to the wagon. Culturally, the Oregon Trail became a shared touchstone for the entire class of 1985 and beyond. It is famous not for its victory screen, but for its creative ways of killing the player. Whether it was a broken leg, a snake bite, or the infamous message, "You have died of dysentery," the game was a masterclass in emergent storytelling. It proved that a computer game could be educational without being boring, provided it was willing to be absolutely ruthless. In the crowded arcades of 1985, Konami decided that shooting wasn't enough. They wanted you to think. Before Gradius, the rules of the scrolling shooter were simple. You saw a power-up, you grabbed it, and your gun instantly got better. Gradius threw that rulebook out the window and introduced the power meter. When you piloted the Vic Viper through the alien Bacterian Empire, picking up an orange capsule didn't do anything immediately. Instead, it highlighted a box on a bar at the bottom of the screen. This forced the player to make a split-second tactical decision. Do you cash in that capsule now for a simple speed-up? Or do you hold on to it, risking death while you hunt for more capsules to purchase the devastating laser or the defensive shield? It transformed the shooter from a test of pure reflexes into a game of resource management and greed. The game's other massive innovation was the option. By saving up enough power, players could summon glowing orange orbs that trailed behind their ship, mimicking their every move and firing their own weapons. A fully powered-up player wasn't just flying a ship, they were controlling a serpentine fleet of destruction. Visually, Gradius was just as distinct. It was a bizarre mix of mechanical bases, biological horrors, and, most famously, giant Easter Island moai heads floating in space. It was weird, it was difficult, and it was undeniably cool. By the end of 1985, Gradius had standardized the horizontal scroller, proving that the genre could be just as deep and strategic as any RPG.
In 1985, Capcom wasn't just making games, they were making legends. And perhaps no game cemented their reputation for brutal, unforgettable difficulty more than Ghosts and Goblins. Released in September 1985, it quickly became an arcade phenomenon, not because players were easily beating it, but because they were constantly trying and failing. You play as the valiant knight Arthur on a quest to rescue Princess Prin from the Demon King Astaroth. Sounds simple, right? It was anything but. Ghosts and Goblins introduced a unique, humiliating, and instantly iconic health system. Arthur begins clad in a full suit of shining armor, but one hit from a zombie, a red Arimer, or a flying gargoyle, and that armor shatters, leaving our hero battling in his polka-dot boxer shorts. Take another hit in your underwear, and it's instant death. This visual feedback of losing your protection became an iconic part of the game's charm and its incredible challenge. The game's difficulty wasn't just about losing armor, it was about relentless enemy design, precise platforming, and an almost sadistic level design. Enemies often spawned from directly below Arthur or dive-bombed him from unpredictable angles. Jumps had to be pixel perfect, and even the simple act of throwing Arthur's lance felt slow and clunky, adding to the tension. Many considered the game unfair, yet its tight controls and distinct art style kept players pumping in quarters. But the ultimate test of endurance came at the very end. If you managed to survive the grueling 6 stages, defeat the final boss, and rescue the princess, the game had one last cruel twist. You were informed that it was a decoy room, and you had to play the entire game again on a higher difficulty to see the true ending. In 1985, Ghosts and Goblins wasn't just a game, it was a rite of passage. It cemented Capcom's reputation for crafting incredibly challenging but deeply rewarding arcade experiences, and its influence on action platformers is still felt today. In a year dominated by arcade twitch reflexes, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar asked players to put down the sword and pick up a conscience. Before 1985, the role-playing genre was universally defined by a single trope: a great evil threatens the land and you must kill it. Richard Garriott, the creator known as Lord British, looked at the players of his previous games and realized they were acting like sociopaths, stealing from shopkeepers and murdering villagers just because the game allowed it. With Ultima 4, he decided to challenge players not to just conquer a dungeon, but to conquer themselves. The game completely removed the concept of a main antagonist. There is no dark wizard or dragon to slay at the end. Instead, the ultimate goal is to become the Avatar, a spiritual leader who embodies the 8 virtues: honesty, compassion, valor, justice, sacrifice, honor, spirituality, and humility. This philosophical shift started the moment you booted the disc. Instead of rolling dice for strength or dexterity, you were given a psychological test by a gypsy fortune teller. Your answers to ethical dilemmas, not your desire for high stats, determined your character class. You can actually watch a complete walkthrough of the game without commentary in my other channel, Game Walk Tutor. The genius of Ultima 4 was that the game was constantly judging you in the background. If you stole a chest of gold, your honesty score dropped. If you fled from a battle against a weak enemy, you lost valor. If you attacked a non-hostile creature, you lost justice and potentially honor. To beat the game, you had to master these hidden stats, essentially forcing the player to act like a saint rather than a mass murderer. It transformed the RPG from a spreadsheet of damage numbers into a simulation of ethics, proving that in 1985, the hardest boss fight wasn't a monster, it was your own behavior. Designed by Ed Logg, the arcade veteran behind Asteroids, Gauntlet was originally inspired by a lesser-known Atari 800 game called Bondi. Logg took the concept of a top-down dungeon crawler and refined it into the ultimate quarter muncher. The brilliance of the game lay in its asymmetry. In 1985, most multiplayer games just gave player 2 a different colored sprite with the exact same abilities. Gauntlet forced you to choose a role. You had to choose between Thor the warrior, Merlin the wizard, Thyra the Valkyrie, and Questor the elf. This class system meant that a single player was vulnerable, but a full team of 4 was a military unit. The warrior held the choke points, the wizard nuked the generators, and the elf raced ahead to grab keys. However, the game's economy was built on treachery. The game didn't have a traditional lives system. Instead, your health was a constantly ticking timer. Every second of gameplay cost you health points. Taking damage cost you more. The only way to replenish it was to find food or insert another coin. This turned the food items, plates of turkey and jugs of cider, into the most valuable currency in the arcade. While players had to cooperate to survive the swarm, they would often betray each other the moment food appeared on screen. The level design was an endless descent into madness. Gauntlet didn't have an ending. It featured over 100 unique level layouts, but once you cleared them, the game would flip the map horizontally or vertically and loop forever, increasing the difficulty until the players ran out of money. It was a test of endurance, not skill. To understand how Gauntlet managed to put hundreds of monsters on screen without melting down, you have to look inside the massive wooden cabinet at the Atari System 1 hardware. This was a standardized motherboard that Atari Games designed to be a workhorse, but Gauntlet pushed it to its absolute limit. The brain of the operation was the Motorola 68010 processor. This was a significant upgrade over the standard 68000 found in the Amiga and Macintosh. The 68010 had a slightly more efficient instruction set, which was critical because the game logic had to track the independent AI, health, and position of hundreds of enemies, plus 4 human players, simultaneously.
Visually, the game relied on a dedicated motion object system. While the NES struggled to put 8 sprites on a line, the Atari System 1 used a banked memory system that allowed it to display massive amounts of sprites, up to 384 motion objects on screen at once. The generators, the piles of bones that spawned ghosts, were essentially hardware loops, utilizing the system's ability to reuse sprite data rapidly. This is why the enemies all looked identical. The hardware was just painting the same ghost graphic over and over at different coordinates to save VRAM. The audio was equally complex. Gauntlet used a Yamaha YM2151 for the music, providing that crisp FM synthesis sound. But the real star was the TMS5220C speech synthesizer chip. This dedicated piece of silicon was responsible for the narrator's voice. To save precious memory, the speech wasn't recorded as a full audio file. It was stored as LPC data, mathematical models of the human vocal tract. The chip would read this data and synthesize the words, "Elf shot the food," in real time, allowing for a huge variety of phrases that would have been impossible with standard sampling. In 1985, Gauntlet wasn't just a fun game, it was a masterpiece of resource management, utilizing a high-end CPU and specialized audio chips to create a chaotic swarm that lesser hardware simply couldn't replicate.
In a quest day of autumn 1985, Super Mario Bros. Was released, and suddenly the world was blue. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, this wasn't just a sequel to the 1983 arcade game Mario Bros. It was a total reinvention of how a video game could feel, move, and sound. It was the killer app that didn't just sell the Nintendo Entertainment System, it convinced the world that video games were a medium with a future. The genius of the game lies in its opening seconds. World 1/1 is widely considered the greatest tutorial in history because it teaches you everything without saying a word. You start on the left. There is empty space to the right, inviting you to move. You encounter a Goomba, an angry mushroom with a face, walking toward you. It looks mean, but its shape is round and simple. You try to jump over it. If you mistime it and land on its head, it squishes. In 3 seconds, you have learned the core mechanic of the next decade of gaming. Jump on things to kill them. Then comes the super mushroom. It moves to the right, bouncing off a pipe, forcing you to chase it. Even if you try to avoid it, the low ceiling often forces you to touch it. Suddenly, Mario grows. You are now powerful. You can break bricks. You understand the rules. But the real revolution was the physics. Before 1985, platforming characters moved stiffly. When you let go of the joystick, they stopped instantly. Mario had momentum. When you ran, he gathered speed. When you stopped, he skidded. When you jumped, you could control his trajectory in midair with a subtle aftertouch. This gave the controls a sense of weight and fluidity that was physically satisfying. It transformed simply moving across the screen from a chore into a joy. Then there was the scope. Miyamoto didn't just build an obstacle course, he built a world. It had a sky you could climb into via beanstalks, an underworld you could access through pipes, and underwater levels that changed the physics entirely. He filled this world with secrets, invisible blocks, hidden coins, and the legendary warp zones. These secrets turned the playground rumor mill into the most powerful marketing engine on Earth. Finding the minus world or the infinite one-up trick wasn't just a gameplay moment, it was cultural currency. Finally, the experience was bound together by Koji Kondo's soundtrack. In 1985, game music was usually a short, repetitive loop of beeps. Kondo wrote a legitimate musical composition with a Latin-infused calypso rhythm that synced perfectly with the character's movement. It was dynamic. When the timer dipped below 100 seconds, the tempo accelerated, inducing genuine panic in the player. Super Mario Bros. Was the dividing line.
Everything before it was the golden age of arcades. Everything after it was the console era. It took the jagged, difficult, abstract nature of video games and smoothed it out into a bright, colorful, scrolling adventure that anyone could pick up, but no one wanted to put down. In 1985, Mario didn't just save the princess, he saved the industry.